Dr. Tharoor, welcome to In Conversation.
Thank you, Lynn. Delighted to be with you.
If we look at the administration of Manmohan Singh, they argued that it was possible to separate the two things. In other words, you could have an economic trade relationship with China, but that didn't have to actually impact what was happening on the security front, specifically, of course, in areas like the border regions.
Well, listen, this has been the line that followed by both the Manmohan Singh government and the Modi government till October 2019, when you saw the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, and Chinese President Xi Jinping meeting at the Southeast Indian resort town of Mahabalipuram and grandly pledging to take relations between their two countries to greater heights to mark the 70th anniversary of formal diplomatic relations between the two countries. You're quite right that it decided to really prevent these tensions around the border from overwhelming the trade relationship. The attitude was, let's relegate the border problem to the back burner. Let's let trade grow. It was close to $100 billion at its peak. And let's stay away from any anti-Chinese strategy the US might want to inveigle us into. That was, broadly speaking, the Indian approach. But that grand talk of Sino-Indian cooperation founded on the astonishing Chinese decision to seize territory on the border. And I think India has its own challenges with China, which have been unfortunately most tragically reflected in the killing of 20 Indian soldiers on the icy line of actual control, the de facto border between the two countries. And once those Indian soldiers were killed, Indian opinion, public opinion, and government opinion has hardened considerably against China. There were terrible stories as the coffins came back to the villages from which these soldiers had hailed. It just became impossible for the government not to show that it was capable of a stiffer backbone. Mind you, the Chinese are still in possession of that extra territory. And I must say that in these circumstances, no Indian government is just going to sit back and accept humiliation. So all the talk of October 2019 was dead by October 2020. That's when the change really happened.
Dr. Tharoor, I mean, if Indians, completely normal Indians on the street, on the ground, were asked, would they be willing to give up their Vivo or Oppo phones because they're actually made in China and by one of the largest Chinese producers of such phones? Do you think that they would?
The affordable smartphones, the ones under about 10,000 rupees, it's completely dominated by Chinese companies, but that's also been made possible by the fact that India has been very reasonable on taxing these phones and keeping prices low, assembling some of them in India, all of that. What happens if India decides that they might, for example, raise taxes on these phones? They might give incentives to other companies from other countries to assemble even cheaper phones in India, or that they might give incentives to the local Indian manufacturers that were driven out of business by Chinese companies like Micromax and so on, which at one point were market leaders in India, and this got completely squeezed into extinction. What about if they get incentives to come back in? I think the Indian consumer is price sensitive. He's not nationality sensitive. So as long as conditions are created where others can match the price of a Vivo or an Oppo, he is not going to be a voice for better relations with the country that makes Vivo and Oppo. I don't think that anyone's going to go as far as the somewhat dramatic character who smashed his Chinese-made TV set the day those 20 soldiers were killed and broadcast footage of his doing so, and it made it to all the news channels. I didn't see a rash of people destroying Chinese-made TVs. The bigger issue is, India has not shown any desire to rock the boat with China. And the Chinese used to take the line, look, let the border be settled by future generations. Right now, let's focus on the economy and on trade and on prosperity. And that line worked on both sides between India and China. However, all that is now up in the air. And that's why I'm somewhat mystified about China's willingness to jeopardize all of these things with a rather substantial neighbor to its southern flank, just for the sake of a few square meters of territory. I find this a few square kilometers of territory along the line of actual control.
What about the US wanting to use India as a foil to a rising China?
Well, look, I mean, this is something that's been going on for a while. It goes all the way back to George Bush 43. I mean, this whole business of the strategy of containment and so on, which India has stoutly resisted because India rightly says that it has its own relationship with China, given that China is a next door neighbor and that India has its own history with China. I think India is going to be walking a bit of a tightrope here. India has taken bigger steps forward towards giving meaning to the quadrilateral dialogue, the so-called Quad. Amongst other things, it conducted a very small scale, very modest naval exercise, which involved Navy ships from all four countries of the Quad, that is US, Japan, Australia, and India. It's talking to these countries more and more about larger issues. And there is always the likelihood that that may translate into a policy, what I would call constraining China, not containing China, which is a hostile policy that says we won't engage with you, but constraining China, which says we will maintain our relations with China, we'll trade with China, we'll talk to China, but we will get together with other countries and limit how much leverage China has over things that matter to us.
What about those who say that the Biden administration is not going to be, in fact, as friendly as one might think they might be, and that we're going to see very much of what the Trump administration's done carried on?
No, I'm not sure it's going to continue in quite the same way. I think there will certainly be challenges within any two sovereign countries where there's some sort of lack of congruence on their domestic interests and ours. But we don't have any major geostrategic problems with each other. So I think these will all be contained. However, they won't be the same as Trump. Trump got into a very belligerent mini trade war with India over the sale of Harley Davidson motorcycles and somewhat petty things like that, which I don't see Biden doing. Similarly, the Democrats traditionally have been strong voices for democracy and human rights globally in their domestic space. And though I don't expect Biden or Harris to say things publicly as the administration that they might have said publicly as senators, nonetheless, one can expect that there's going to be a little more, shall we say, sensitivity to any poor behavior by the Modi government in these areas.
Now, with the departure of President Trump from the White House, some say that the era of the strongman, of the political leader who's right at the top and says what he thinks, is on the decline. And that will also mean that the kind of nationalism that Mr. Modi also promotes might be on the decline. Do you agree?
It's difficult to generalize about that. And there is no doubt that COVID actually led a number of people like Mr. Modi, Mr. Trump, Mr. Erdogan in Turkey, various others, to say that we need more strong government. We need governments that can protect our people better from the ravages of these pandemics. We need more strict controls. We need more surveillance. So that was very much the approach of Mr. Modi and his defenders. And I must tell you that it has not hurt him in India, even though many of us are appalled by that approach. I think, liberal Democrats like myself would want to be able to agree with you that the era of the strongman leader is over. I think one particular would-be strongman has fallen on his face and done so with rather ill grace, I might add, in America. But I think the others are very much in place, and it's far too early to write their political obituaries.
What about those who say that these strongmen actually are based and anchored in normal people, in what normal people actually believe in where their voices haven't been heard. And that a liberal Democrat like yourself actually represents the elite who are out of touch, and you don't really know how the ordinary guy who owns a Vivo or an Oppo phone feels.
Well, look, I think most ordinary people everywhere and most elite people everywhere want to live in decent conditions of life. And some things will matter more to others, but everyone wants, 3 square meals a day, a roof over their heads, a decent job and the prospect of earning more from it, educational possibilities for their children, and the opportunity to look forward to improving their lives. That's true of every human being on this planet. And if a leader convinces them that he can
Sir,
deliver
can I
all of
interrupt
that,
you there? That's not entirely true. Some parents would say that, for example, a girl doesn't have to have an education. So the parent doesn't want to have better prospects for all of their kids.
But those are very minority elements. I mean, even in a country like India, with all its conservativeness and conservatism and backwardness in many places, I would argue that the number of parents who would actually say they don't want their daughters to be educated would be well below 10%. We're seeing this in the dramatic increase in female literacy right across the country, including in all religious communities and even in the rural areas and the poorest villages. Things are changing. The challenge we have is a leader who says he can deliver all these things, but doesn't necessarily deliver them effectively. Now, I think those are things that you may be right. Many ordinary people in the street may not care about or think about very often, whereas indeed liberal Democrats, newspaper readers, op-ed readers will say, you're undermining federal principles, you're undermining our democracy, and we will be talking perhaps only to a very small educated minority, but that doesn't mean we're not right, and it doesn't mean that we're not right to say so.
Do you think that Mr. Modi is an Asian Trump?
No, I think I'll give him a little more credit than that, Lynn, because the fact is that Mr. Trump's idiosyncrasies, such as his rather erratic 3 a.m. tweeting, his quite flagrant disregard for reality, and some of his intemperate language, I don't think anyone can accuse Mr. Modi of any of those things. We have our own issues with Mr. Modi, but they're certainly not the same kinds of issues that American liberals had with Mr. Trump. I think Mr. Modi is his own person. He is, however, somebody who in many ways has not turned out to be the kind of person that either his critics or his admirers expected. I mean, he talked a very good game about economic growth, development, jobs. His big slogan in 2014 was Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, together with everyone, development for everyone. And he's neither been together with everyone nor given development for everyone. That's our problem. He has divided everyone and he has slowed economic growth. And so our concerns are very different, I'd say, than a facile Trumpian analogy would suggest.
And what about also his pro-Hindu stance? That has also been something that he's propagated.
That's correct. So 5 months into his tenure, I published a book called India Shastra, in which I wrote that Mr. Modi, I beg your pardon, has a central contradiction in his rule, which I believe I said at that time, just 5 months into 2014, I said, will trip him up. And that is the problem between the good game he talks about development and growth and prosperity and his reliance on some of the most illiberal forces in Indian politics in order to keep himself in power. So if he's got to ride on the coattails of the Hindu chauvinists, the Hindutva movement, the RSS, the Bajrang Dal, and people who are his political stormtroopers, the ones who go out and canvass for votes and organize his election victories, how does he actually then fulfill the pledge to take everyone along and bring economic growth for everyone? That's really the challenge that Mr. Modi faces.
Do you think that we as Southeast Asians should be afraid of India? That you're a dominant, rising power, just the way that China is?
If you look, for example, at India's relations with both ASEAN and China up to now, there is no question that an unequal trading relationship has developed without even a semblance of reciprocity. And India has not been complaining from the rooftops. All the trade balance after the free trade agreement with ASEAN and all the trade balance with China have been absolutely in favor of the others. And India has said, still go along, saying, let's do it. This is simply the way India is. India, on the whole, says we will work with everybody. And I think that ASEAN countries have known this. One of the reasons that India has been invited by the ASEAN countries to be members of the East Asian Summit, even though by no stretch of the geographical imagination can India be considered an East Asian power, is precisely because these countries don't feel threatened by India. They feel India would be a welcome, positive, and largely benign contributor to such forums. And I think India is proud of that reputation. We won't want to do anything to destroy that reputation we have, that other countries like us and are not threatened by us.
Not everybody realizes that 60% or so of all vaccines in the world are already produced in India. Do you think that India is going to do a certain amount of vaccine nationalism, that you're going to want to hoard vaccines for the Indian population?
The Serum Institute of India, which is far and away the largest vaccine manufacturer on the planet, says that they have decided to risk their capital in anticipation of approval and start manufacturing literally 1 billion doses of vaccine. And that means that half of those will be kept for India and half will be exported out, probably to the poorer countries, because the richer ones have already gone for the more expensive Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. I don't think India would at all think of itself as interested in vaccine nationalism. It'll keep a portion, maybe half, of everything it manufactures for the needy Indian consumers. It'll prioritize them, healthcare workers, doctors, perhaps older people, but it will not say we will not export what we're making to others when others are in need. That just isn't India. And if it does that, many of us in the opposition will stand up and criticize any government that does that, because that's just not what India is all about. That's not the India that Mahatma Gandhi taught and brought to the position that it now has in the world.
And you yourself, would you take the vaccine? Would you get vaccinated?
Yes, I would, but I'm not going to jump the queue. The problem in our country, unfortunately, is the so-called VIP culture, where political leaders, ministers, or former ministers like myself, opposition MPs, all of us expect to be able to jump the queue. I think that's wrong. I think we should step back and let the government announce a policy as to who deserves it first. If those who deserve it first are, for example, people above 80 or above 90 even, we should wait for all of them to be done before we get our turn. I'm expecting, though, that both on grounds of age as well as anything else, that I may not be too far behind in the queue. But I'm certainly not going to rush to jump the queue.
If we look in 1 year from now, 2021, and I talk to you again in December, what sort of India are we going to be looking at?
Well, I would say that in 2021, India's priorities are very clear. First, it has to significantly pick up its economy, and particularly the employment portion of it, because there are lots and lots, I mean, I'm talking millions of people who've been thrown out of work literally every month since the COVID lockdowns began. I would hope, and I speak very much as an opposition MP here, that the government will be well advised to back away from some of its negative domestic policies that needlessly divided our people on particularly issues of religion and religious practice, and that the government would instead focus on the economy, because that's really in the interests of all Indians. And finally, I hope that this government would also try and promote both social cohesion and economic growth as imperatives if India is going to be taken seriously by investors from outside. We've all known since Dr. Manmohan Singh's time anyway, that the key to India's success story has been foreign investment. What we want is investment going into the real economy, producing goods and giving people jobs. And that will only happen if investors feel that India is worth betting on. It's an opportunity, certainly, to do things differently, more efficiently, with less red tape and with less procedural obstacles to rapid action. So yes, we would expect to see an India that's a little more nimble on its feet. I hope and pray that our government will do the right things to make sure that the world believes that India is still a country worth betting on.
Dr. Tharoor, thank you very much for being on In Conversation.
Thank you very much, Lynn. My pleasure.